I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about agriculture right here in Utah, along the Wasatch Front. And back in 1975, Arvel Stark, who was a horticultural extension agent at Utah State University, said one of the most profitable things we can plant on an old orchard is in fact a new housing division. And that has not changed. In fact, we could really argue that agriculture as a way of life is really on its way out in this part of the country. And real changes are occurring. There are also great potential for new opportunities, though, and that is partly what I'd like to talk to you about today. So briefly, the overview of my talk. I'd like to define sustainable agriculture for you because many people have questions about this. Then I'd like to talk about the challenges to sustainable tree fruit production along the Wasatch Front, potential solutions, and finally, a little bit just to touch on some of the new research projects that we are conducting at Utah State University to try to begin to address some of these issues. So this is the famous quote that many of you have referred to, the famous definition of sustainability. But what does that really mean when we talk about agriculture and sustainable agriculture? Well, first of all, for agriculture to be sustainable, of course, it must be environmentally safe, socially responsible, and economically viable. Those are the three spheres of sustainability that we have heard so much about over these past day. But also, I like to think, specifically in terms of agriculture, we need to think of resources in particular, and also yields. And these are very intimately connected. You know, agriculture depends on resources in order for it to be productive. And organic agriculture is no different in this regard. Organic agriculture was developed in temperate Europe and temperate North America, and it can be very self-sufficient when it occurs in an environment that has a lot of local resources from which to draw on. But this may not be sustainable or the most sustainable option in environments such as this, which have very low productivity. And which is really why it is very, very important to realize that sustainable agriculture must be place-specific. We need to really realize that we can't just take solutions that have worked in one area and automatically assume that they can work in a different environment. And it also means that there's incredible challenges for researchers as well as opportunities for researchers and growers together to develop solutions and strategies that are place-specific. So, okay, what about the challenges here? This is the Wasatch Front along here, Salt Lake City. This area is a historical prime location for tree fruit production in Utah. When the settlers first started arriving in Utah, they pretty much tried to grow fruits wherever they settled, and very soon, very quickly found out that tree fruits really thrived exclusively along this region here. And there's a reason for that. It's because it's the edges of the ancient Lake Bonneville, these bench areas that were historically the old orchards because they experienced good drainage, good air drainage. And with such a short growing season that we experience here in Utah, that's critical in order to have a viable crop production system that's not subject to late frosts destroying the crop. And so, of course, this is also the region that people like to live. People like to live up on these same bench areas. The Wasatch Front is subject to some of the fastest development pressure in the United States, and there's a conflict there. Dwindling water resources, of course, another big problem in such an arid state, and rising costs of inputs. Historically, fertilizers, pesticides have been cheap. That is no longer the case, to the point where growers themselves are saying, look, we need alternatives. We need to think about how can we start to grow some of our own fertility and reduce our reliance on pesticides, because for the first time, this is becoming a significant part of our bottom line. And dwindling export markets have also played a very large role in the decline of agriculture and tree fruit in particular along the Wasatch Front. Utah had primarily a export-based market, and with increased global competition, much of those markets have disappeared. Okay, so what does Utah's fruit tree industry look like? Well, according to a recent survey conducted in 2006 by Utah State University, there's only 306 operations left in the state, comprising 6,644 acres, and the majority of this land is in tart cherries. There's very good reason for that I'll go into later. Apples and peaches form the second largest percentage of fruits grown. This is some of the same data, but shown over trend over time. In 1978, with a slight rise in the mid-80s, there's really been a steady decline in tree fruit acreage, and we're now at historic lows. And as you notice here, tart cherries are really the only crop that have maintained their share and have remained stable. And so again, if we look at the total number of farms in 1974, we've had a decrease. We've also had a decrease in the total number of acres farmed. But if we break that down into the size of farms that are really affected, here you can see there's actually been a slight increase in the percentage of small farms here in Utah. And also the large farms, and in Utah, a large farm means 50 acres plus, which is not that big, but still large farms have remained viable and have actually increased their acreage. So really, as we've seen across the country, the largest impact has been felt in these mid-sized farms, traditional family farms. As I said, statewide, Utah is experiencing some of the fastest population growth in the country, 2.3% growth, and Utah's population is projected to double in the next 30 years. Where are all those people going to go is a really good question, because if you drive, drive along this area, it already seems that it's incredibly built up. And much of this population growth is occurring basically along, as I said earlier, those same areas that were historical tree fruit production areas. Now this slide I apologize, the data's a little bit old, but taken from the Jordan Valley Water Conservation District, shows that projected water demand through 2035, and that even with conservation measures, we don't know where our water is going to come from, how we're going to meet the projected demand. And so, of course, this means increased competition between urban needs and agricultural needs. And finally, climate change. This is a theme we've heard a lot about in this conference. We've documented that on average, the first bud break is occurring 2 weeks earlier in Utah, the Intermountain region, Pacific Northwest. But there has been no change in the last frost date. So what that means is that you're getting increasing occurrences of killing frosts, bud-killing frosts, and harvest failure as a result. So increased risk associated with growing tree fruits in this region. So why should we care? Maybe you could really argue that agriculture as a way of life is on its way out here in this part of the country. But I would argue that we should care. And one of the reasons we should care is because of these ecosystem services that we've been hearing about. Agriculture provides ecosystem services. Yes, I know that it's true. Many forms of agriculture are actually quite disruptive and maybe polluting. However, that does not need to be the case, and we should all recognize that managed ecosystems, agriculture being one of them, are really the matrix within which natural ecosystems find themselves these days. And so the quality of that agricultural matrix is really key to biodiversity and ecosystem services as a whole, to preserving those. This doesn't always seem to work this well. Provisioning services, of course, providing food and fiber is the major goal of agriculture, but also agriculture can provide supporting services such as soil quality, biodiversity, insect pollinators, as well as regulating services, climate and water quality, and finally, the cultural services. Here in Utah, if you poll the population, general population, there's a strong consensus that the agricultural traditions are valued here, very much so. However, there isn't always the political will to try and find the means to sustain their future viability. And it really all comes down to the quality of life in this region. And do we wish for local food, locally produced food, and agricultural green space to contribute to that quality of life? So what are some of the potential solutions? Well, for the larger farms, labor automation may be one of the key technological breakthroughs that we will need to consider in the future. And there's a reason for that. Labor is probably the single largest cost in tree fruit production right now. And if you look again at this, the tart cherry data, tart cherries have been the single crop that's maintained their acreage over time. And the reason for that is that tart cherries are mechanically harvested. So there's a lot of research and a lot of interest now in mechanical harvesting techniques for other tree fruits. And that could really, really help some of our larger farmers stay in business. And I should point out that in Utah, the large farms are the innovators. They are the early adopters. They are the farmers who are really thinking, how can we best improve the efficiency of our farming, the sustainability of our farming, not just economically, but also socially and environmentally. There have been very strong breakthroughs here in Utah State to do with integrated pest management, for instance, basically using monitoring systems and natural predators to basically cut down the amount of pesticides that are needed. And it's got to the point that many Utah farmers are saying, okay, maybe we can think about organic production, when really that was not the case in the past. The reason for that is because their pest management strategies are already almost organic. So there have been incredible progresses made in this field. So organic, yes. Diversification. Really, the key to sustainable agriculture is, in my opinion, diversification. That means diversifying the crops that we grow, but also diversifying our markets and also our branding. And there has been a huge increase in interest in foods with a story, local foods, farmer with a face. All these interests very much strongly are linked to urban development. So urban development also increases these kinds of diversified and novel market opportunities. I say novel because it's definitely non-traditional. And of course, the organic label has led the way in this. Organic production and organic market sales have continued to rise. Organic foods have been growing at a rate of 15 to 20% over the last 20 years, and it really hasn't slowed that much during the recession. It's been incredibly resilient to the recession, and this surprised many people. And I think that's because so many people do care. They want to know where their food comes from. They want the assurance that maybe their food is being produced in a way that has reduced external impacts on the environment. But as I said earlier, maybe organic is not the only solution. The Food Alliance certifies other forms of sustainable agriculture, such as no-till agriculture, for instance. In Washington State, the Shepherd's Grain label has become very successful, a way of branding, a way of telling the public they have a story to tell, they have a sustainable farming practice that they are conducting, and as a result, they can charge a premium for their product, and people are willing to pay that. So I think that an urban environment really creates opportunities for urban agriculture and diversification to meet these new needs of the marketplace. Direct marketing is very much part of this diversification strategy. Of course, the traditional fruitway, fruit stands, but also this is the Red Barn in Santaquin, Utah, where they have these value-added products and you can stop and visit their store. And community-supported agriculture, box schemes. These provide incredible opportunities, education opportunities for young people to get involved. And there's just a incredible rise in interest in these kinds of activities. I mentioned value-added products, the ability of a grower to capture more of that dollar on the end food product value. But also agrotourism. Agrotourism is becoming very popular in parts of the country, particularly the East Coast, because urban livers are increasingly hungry for farm experiences for their children in particular. And so we have pumpkin walks or little pumpkin train. You have at Easter, you have Easter egg hunts down at the farm, fresh produce and berries for sale, or just a roadside stand with amenities and a little farm walk and different things that people can experience. What they remember maybe as a rural lifestyle. A few more pictures to show you, taken from Butler's farm in Maryland. They were recently out here talking to the Utah Hort Association about their agrotourism activities. They're primarily a you-pick berry operation. However, they've diversified to include you-pick flowers, a hay barn, sort of fun rides for children. In the Christmas, they have Christmas trees that you can go and cut your own Christmas tree, and birthday parties, farm birthday parties. They were charging over $300 for a group of children to come have a birthday cake, pick some berries, and have a farm birthday party. They charge entrance fees. They've been raising their fees to the point where they don't believe that people might be still interested, but people still are very much interested, and their visitors have not declined at all. In fact, it's just going up. So there's, of course, this is not traditional farming. When I mention this, many farmers go, but I don't want people on my land, I'm a private person. But nevertheless, for the right personality, for a large family, opportunities for other family members to get involved in diversifying the business into these unusual avenues really could provide local growers with the opportunity to stay viable in a rapidly urbanizing environment. So finally, a little bit about new research opportunities. Finally, what is needed if we are going to develop a viable tree fruit industry along the Wasatch Front, or not develop, but maintain its viability? Of course, we need improved agricultural practices. This is the traditional realm of the land-grant university, and we are moving in developing organic managed programs that are place-specific, suited for Utah's country. We were recently successful in getting a large grant to help us do that, and also to develop the extension infrastructure that goes with that, so that people who are interested in transitioning to organic have the means and the knowledge that they can access to do that. So we're very excited about that. It's just in its early stages, but there is actually a lot of grower interest. I should add that currently we don't have, I think we just have a single certified orchard, which is down in the St. George area in Utah. Utah has the perfect climate for organic tree fruit production, just as Washington State does. So it's an untapped opportunity in this region. but also integrated solutions. And by integrated, not just integrated pest management, but also integrated fertility, orchard floor management, ways to reduce the amount of resources that are needed in the farm, by the farm. So what does sustainable agriculture or integrated agriculture look like in Utah? And we don't really know yet. We're just starting to develop these things. But spraying mulches, this is a spray-on-paper mulch. Spraying mulches on the surface or experimenting with different mulches to conserve water is key for this region. And of course we know it's not rocket science. We know that mulches are going to conserve water, but we are actually trying to quantify the amount of water that we can actually save through these practices. Organic systems typically rely on tillage around the trees. And this, of course, is problematic. It's problematic because you use energy to do the tillage operations. You also disturb the soil, drive off CO2, and it also disrupts the roots of the trees. However, young trees in particular, are incredibly sensitive to competition from weeds. So some kind of understory management is essential. So for organic systems, of course, this might be an ideal. You're growing some kind of shallow-rooted, flowering annual that reseeds itself every year and can compete out most of the weeds, but hopefully wouldn't compete with the trees too heavily. Unfortunately, that's not what we're seeing. We are still seeing some pretty drastic competition to those trees, and right now our goal is to see if we can't mitigate that by targeted water and nutrient additions. But I don't know. At least for young trees and organic systems, we may be limited. The better option over tillage may be some kind of plastic mulch, which of course has whole sustainability issues associated with it too. So my point here is that organic farming doesn't have all the answers, particularly in a challenging environment such as Utah with short growing seasons, when we can't grow much of the biomass over the winter when the trees are dormant. What else is needed? I think we need to start to think about subsidies. Currently, we do subsidize agriculture. We subsidize production agriculture for the grains, the commodities that we need. But what about subsidizing the ecosystem services that we also need? The growers that I speak to frequently say, we would love to improve the environmental sustainability of our operation. We can't afford to do that. Organic farmers are lucky. They've managed to capture that market premium that enable them to do some of these things. But often these management practices are expensive. And if we are going to expect growers to become stewards of the land in the wider sense of these ecosystem services that society as a whole depends on, we need to find a way to compensate for them for that, I think. Tax issues are increasingly, the increasing tax issues associated with some of these new urban agricultural development zoning. For example, right now, an agricultural zoned land, a farmer is allowed to have a farm stand under agricultural zoning, but what's the definition of a farm stand? And this becomes increasingly complicated when we start talking about agrotourism, and the real question starts to occur whether that's a farm or it's a theme park. These are legal issues and policy issues that are going to have to be resolved. And protecting our agricultural land, is that something we want to do? I mentioned earlier that so far there has not been the political will to do that in Utah, despite the fact that I think close to 100% of the population really values the agricultural culture and tradition in this state. But I think we need to start to think why that is and ask those questions. Well, why is it that you might be against the right to sell your farm to a developer? And I think that comes down to issues of poverty and just, proper remuneration, because many of these farmers are land rich but cash poor. And so traditionally, their land or the resources on their land are the money that sends their kids to college or their retirement or whatever. So we need to think of these wider social aspects when we talk about sustainability, especially in areas that are experiencing rapid increases in the value of farmland and the resources on that land. And that comes down to this popular term, systems research, which really means expanding the boundaries of the systems that we're considering. We need to include scientists from across the disciplines in this effort, as well as all the, the stakeholders and the farmers and the environmentalists and the urban residents. Everyone is going to have to come to the table to really solve these issues together. Of course, this is complicated. It can be very difficult, a slow, challenging process, and many of us are not used to working in these ways. Nevertheless, I personally believe that it's the only way to move forward, to avoid some of the unintended consequences that have happened in the past. I think it's fair to say that the Green Revolution didn't set out to create dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. That was an unintended consequence of a lack of communication between the various players in this area, including the scientists developing these systems. So with that, I'd just like to acknowledge my colleagues who contributed data and photos. Thank you.